Okay, we're going to try to cover chapters 12 through 14. Before we begin reading, let me just say a little bit. First, I want to just remind you of the structure of the book of Revelation. We've said this now a few weeks, but I'd just like to remind you of it. Most scholars think that there's two major divisions in the book of Revelation. Chapters 1 through 11 is the first half, and then chapters 12 through 22 are the second half. And so as we start in chapter 12 today, recognize that we're starting a new major section of the book of Revelation. Of course, in the first section, we talked about this tremendous vision that John had of the throne, surrounded by the four elders and the four living creatures and the 24 elders and thousands upon 10,000s of angels and all creatures under heaven. They're all worshiping God, and Jesus is on the throne, and he takes the scroll and he begins to open the seven seals. And as he does so, that gives rise to seven trumpets, and we've talked about the warnings and the initial judgments that God brings using all parts of this world, but finally how there's the church, the two witnesses who are called to preach God's word, to warn people of the coming wrath and tell them the gospel and the good news. So that was all in chapters 1 through 11, and we talked about how there's a struggle on earth between believers and non-believers and what that's all about. As we get to chapter 12 and then through chapter 22, I think I mentioned this, that you can think of the book of Revelation in three different ways, right? The book of Revelation is a letter that John is writing to these seven churches. We talked about it as a prophecy, which gives both hope and warning. But then on top of that, we talked about it as an apocalypse. And what's an apocalypse? It's an unveiling or a revelation. And of course, there's some people, they look at the book of Revelation like it's a riddle, like, I got to solve this puzzle or riddle. But actually, what the book is trying to accomplish is this, that our life is a riddle, right? Jesus has conquered, he's overcome, God is on the throne, he's chosen us to be his people, he's at work in our life. Then why are we suffering? Why is there heartache? Why is there trouble? And life presents a little bit of a riddle. And the book of Revelation is seeking to unveil or unlock that riddle. It's seeking to show us what lies, I put it this way, behind the curtain. And I think especially as we get to chapter 12, we are going to see the spiritual struggle that's going on behind the curtain of our everyday life. So that's a little preview about what we're going to get into. I did also mention with regard to the structure of the book of Revelation that, at least the way I see it, and many scholars see it, there is a seven parallel sections within the book of Revelation. We've taken note as we've gone along how important the number 7 is in the book of Revelation, whether it's the 7 lampstands or 7 stars or 7 churches or 7 seals or 7 trumpets or 7 thunders, or we'll soon get to the 7 bowls. The number 7 is a very important number in the book of Revelation. And it does appear that this book has a sevenfold structure. And the structure describes each of the sevenfold parallel sections describe the time period from the first to the second coming of Christ. And I'll put here on the screen, I've shown before this slide, the 7 parallel sections. So from chapters 1 to 3 and 4 to 7 and 8 to 11, chapters 12 through 14, which we're attempting to cover now. And maybe it's good, so I've tried to make the case that each of these sections covers the time period between the first and the second coming of Christ. Maybe just for a moment, it might be good to kind of see that in chapters 12 through 14. So if you look at chapter 12, I often call these first verses, let's say verses 1 through 6, the Christmas story in the book of Revelation. And I'll just read it, and of course we'll dive a little deeper into it in just a moment, but maybe you can already see how it's the Christmas story. It says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. So we'll dive into that just a little bit more, but here it's a story of Christ's birth told not from the perspective of Mary and Joseph, who are traveling to Bethlehem, and there's a census that has been issued for the entire Roman world, and they travel to Bethlehem, and there's no rooms available, so they're sent out to the stable, and she gives birth to a male child, and she wraps that child in swaddling clothes and places it in a manger. That's an entirely earthly scene, right? It's something we can visualize and think of. This story is as if we could peek behind the spiritual, this physical world, peek behind the curtain to see what's going on in the spiritual world, the kind of battle that was ensuing between Satan and the forces of evil and the angels in heaven themselves. We'll come back to that, but I often call this the Christmas story. Anyway, if you look at chapter 14, and we'll study this a little more in depth as well as we go along. But if you look right to the very end of chapter 14, we're going to see that there's a great harvest. And clearly this is talking about the end times. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. But let's start in verse 14. So I looked, and there before me was a white cloud. And seated on the cloud was one like a son of man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, "Take your sickle and reap, because the time has come, the time to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Take your sharp sickle and gather the cluster of grapes from the earth's vine, because the grapes are ripe." The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered its grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles, for a distance of 1,600 stadia. Anyway, I should have talked to Tom ahead of time. I'm sure you could have done it. You remember this old song, "My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the..." There we go. Where the grapes of wrath are stored, right? This is a reference to Jesus' return and the final coming of Jesus and the judgment day. So, yeah, that's as much as I want to say here. Just want you to see that from chapter 12 to 14, we're spanning the time period between Christ's first coming, right, the Christmas story, and the second coming, this grapes of wrath that we'll spend a little more time talking about. Anyway, let's go back to chapter 12, and let's dig in. A lot to cover here. I want us in this hour to get the big picture of chapters 12, 13, and 14. So I'll begin reading again at verse 1. I think this is unfamiliar kind of stuff to us, so it won't harm us to repeat it. "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled in the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Verse 7, then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. That great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil's gone down to you. He's filled with fury because he knows that his time is short. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. Okay, what are we reading? I think, when you read the book of Revelation, part of you, especially the first read, you just scratch your head and say, what is this about? There's a lot of details here. I always, as I approach the book of Revelation, I'd like to just start to try as best I can to think about what is the big picture. And maybe as a window into that, there are 3 main characters that are here in this chapter. There's the woman, then there's the dragon, then there's the child. And I think if we solve the identity of each of these characters, then the big picture can more easily emerge. So of these 3 characters, actually, it's the dragon who is the easiest to identify, and that is because verse 9 tells us exactly who the dragon is. So let's read that again. It says, the great dragon was hurled down. Then it says, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled down to the earth, and his angels with him. So, this dragon is the easiest to identify because the text of the book of Revelation 12 tells us, okay, that's Satan. That's the devil. That's the prince of the fallen angels. Because, of course, this references that there are other angels who are part of a rebellion, and they also have fallen. So that's the first character and the easiest to identify. When we first meet this character, we meet him in verse 3. It talks about this sign that appears in heaven. There's an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. And it says in verse 4, its tail swept 1/3 of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. Listen, this is probably the only place where we get any sensibilities about this. If you were here last week, we talked about how often in the Old Testament, but also here in the book of Revelation, angels are referred to as stars. Remember this from the book of Job when God was laying the foundations of the earth. It talked about how the morning stars sang for joy. So angels are often referred to as stars, and it gives us an idea here. It says that Satan's tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky. This is the only place I know of in Scripture where we get any sense of how large the angel rebellion was. We know that before Adam and Eve ever came on the scene, there was an angel rebellion. We don't find any passage in Scripture which gives us any real detail. It's just like a background fact of the Bible. But here, numbers in the book of Revelation are symbolic, so I don't know if it's exactly 1/3, and we don't know how many angels there are anyway, but it's more than a quarter, and it's less than half. A substantial portions of the angels rebelled along with Satan against God. These are the demons, these are the fallen angels that we find all throughout Scripture. Anyway, this is the only verse that gives us a sense of the quantity of these fallen angels, and it says it's a third. Anyway, it says in the middle of verse 4 that the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, and he has a purpose so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. Anyway, that's the dragon, that's Satan. Perhaps the second easiest character to identify is the child. So it says in verse 5, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And it says, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. Now, just on first read, who do you think the child is? Okay, this is like a great Sunday school class, right? You say Jesus, it's always the right answer. And I think that's true, and there's a few reasons why I think that's true. I think, first of all, in verse 5, she gave birth to a son, a male child. That actually, the language there really mimics what we read in the birth story of Jesus in Luke 2. Right? She gave birth to a son, a male child. She wrapped the babe in swaddling clothes and placed him in a manger. So, that's at least a little hint. I think there's a big hint right after that. It says, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. Most of you probably see that there's a footnote there that's in quotes. And that verse comes from Psalm 2. Psalm 2 is a messianic psalm. Christians, this is interesting to me. Like, what is our favorite psalms? I think if we took a poll, probably would find out that the 23rd psalm is a favorite of many of ours. Maybe the 46th psalm is a favorite of many of ours. Psalm 2 might well have been the favorite psalm in the early church. Because when the early Christians read the psalm, they said, oh, that psalm's about Jesus. Some of you may later take some time to look at the psalm. It begins this way: why did the nations conspire? Why do the kings of the earth take their stand against the Lord and against his, it says, Messiah? And anyway, Christians said, oh, look at that. The kings of the earth, the rulers of the world, they're conspiring against, the Messiah. And actually, early on in the book of Acts, maybe you remember this, that there was a prayer meeting, and they quoted from the Psalms, and it says, in fact, the rulers of the earth and the kings have conspired against Jesus. Anyway, in that psalm, we find a couple of just famous quotes. One of the quotes is this, that God turns to the Son, to the Anointed One, says, you are my Son. Today I've become your Father. It says, ask of me, and I'll make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. And then it says, you will rule them with an iron scepter. And many Christians just saw, okay, that's Jesus. And so when it says here that he'll rule all the nations with an iron scepter, it's a quote from Psalm 2. And early Christians who said, okay, that's a psalm about Jesus, will say, oh, so this male child is Jesus. There's still one more piece of evidence that I think is very convincing. It's the very next phrase. It says, and her child was snatched up to God and, what's it say? To his throne. And of course now, we've just spent the last 3 weeks talking about the compelling vision in the first half of the book of Revelation is what? John looked and he saw a throne. surrounded by the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders and all of the angels and all creatures under heaven. And you remember in chapter 5, God has in his hand this scroll, and it's sealed, and there's no one who can open the scroll or its seals. And John's weeping, and then an angel taps him on the shoulder and says, "Look, the Lion of the tribe of Judah has triumphed, and he's able to open the scroll and its 7 seals." And John turns around, and remember what he sees? A lamb, looking as if it's been slain, and it says, standing in the center of the throne. And by the way, the book of Revelation just has a very high Christology, a high view of Jesus, that Jesus is God. I mean, how Jesus is on the throne. And here, when it says that this child was snatched up to God and to his throne, for sure that's a reference to Jesus' ascension into heaven and his now reign on the very throne of God. So, okay, I probably didn't have to go through that, because when I asked you who it was, you already knew. Oh, it's Jesus. All right, but we've got that. So the dragon is Satan, the child is Jesus, the woman is the final character. She is probably the most difficult to put your finger on, though my guess is that we have some good guesses right out the start. All right, so one of the guesses that people have, one of the theories that people have, okay, who's the mother of Jesus? Mary, right? So many people say, oh, well, this could be Mary. But I think if you slow down and you begin to look at her description, so look at verse 1, it says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head." Maybe you remember this, Joseph, at one point, in chapter 37 of the book of Genesis, had some dreams. And in his dreams, he saw, a sun and a moon and 12 stars, and all the other stars of the sun and moon were bowing down to his star. That was a picture of the family of Israel, Jacob's family. So this is probably a picture of Old Testament Israel, but maybe even more than that, because after this woman gives birth, she, in verse 6, flees into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of, it says, for 1,260 days. I don't have time to go over these 1,260 days again. We talked about it last week. So if you want to get in depth, you'll have to get the tape. We do have the tape. I don't know if it's out yet or not, but it's coming out. You can go back and watch it. But here's the point: 1,260 days, 42 months, a time, times, and a half a time, all equal 3.5 years. And I said there was a very famous 3.5 years in the Old Testament, which was the time of Elijah. And in chapter 11, the time of Elijah kind of depicted the ministry that we as Christians have. Yes, we're hard-pressed. Yes, we're suffering. But God's given us tremendous power as we give witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that time period, I think whether in chapter 11 or 12 or 13, where we're going to find it next, seems to refer to the time period between Christ's first and second coming, the time in which the church does its ministry. Anyway, because that 1,260 days refers to the time period of the church, probably this woman is not just the Old Testament church, the Old Testament people of God, but also the New Testament people of God. And if you read from verses 13 through 17, you're going to see that after the dragon goes to make war against the church, since he was unable to devour this child, that God takes care of his church, his bride. So, likely, that's the identity of the woman. It's the people of God in the Old and New Testament. And now that we've gotten that far, I just cannot spend any more time with it. I'd say here's the big picture. It's the Christmas story in the book of Revelation. It's like a peek behind the curtain, so to speak. When we often celebrate Christmas, we celebrate Mary and Joseph, and they're going to Bethlehem, and there being no room, and they place their child in the manger and wrap him in swaddling clothes, and it's a very humble scene. But what this is depicting is that for all the quiet, silent night, holy night, for all the quietness of that night, There was a raging spiritual battle that was happening behind the curtain. If you could have peeked into the heavenly realms, you would have seen a major war and battle. So, verse 7, war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But there's more to this war. It's not just there was war. I think there's a message, and the message is this: victory and care. Here's a message of victory. Satan lost, Jesus won. Okay, simple. And if you're a Christian and you find yourself in the midst of struggle and suffering, and it seems like the world's got the upper hand, and is God really in control? Real simple. Satan lost, Jesus won. And there's also a message of care here, because this passage does acknowledge that Satan didn't take that defeat lying down. He's mad. He's on the prowl. He wants revenge. So look at verse 13. It says, when the dragon saw that he'd been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. So, okay, I couldn't get Jesus. I couldn't devour him. I'm going to get his people. But verse 14 says the woman was given the 2 wings of great eagles so she could fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she'd be taken care of for a time, times and a half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then it talks about how the serpent spewed water and tried to overtake the woman. But it says, verse 16, the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Here's the message. Yes, Satan's mad. He's at work behind the scenes trying to attack the church. But Jesus is caring for his church. God is caring for his church. He's not going to let Satan overtake us. He's not going to give Satan the victory. Satan lost. Jesus won. Okay, I can't believe I only have 15 minutes left for the next 2 chapters. I'm going to try to do it as quickly, but as hopefully user-friendly as possible. When we get to chapter 13, we find out that Satan, in his effort to get at the church, employs the help of 2 beasts, two helpers of Satan. And let's just try to get into this. We're going to have to do it expeditiously. Verse 1, the dragon stood on the shore of the sea. And what we're going to see is we're going to see 1 beast come out of the sea and 1 beast come out of the earth. So if you're thinking about this, then you got to picture a dragon who's on the seashore. He's got 1 set of feet in the water and 1 set of feet out of the land. And it's like he's trying to summon these 2 helpers out of each place. So it says, I saw a beast coming out of the sea. This is still verse 1 of chapter 13. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had the feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. And the dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. I'm going to pause right there, because one of the things we've got to do is we've got to identify, like, okay, who's this beast? Like, what is it? And I think we've just been given a clue, though for most of us, maybe the clue just it flew by, because we're just not as familiar with the Old Testament as the early Christians would have been. Keep a finger here, but turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 7. Wait. Before you do, remember this. We've got a beast with 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 crowns. And then I want you to take note of the animals. Verse 2, the beast I saw resembled a leopard, had feet like those of a bear, mouth like those of a lion. Okay, Daniel 7. In the book of Daniel, chapter 7, Daniel has a very disturbing dream. Anyway, let's just try to read it. It says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream. Visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of the dream. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion. It had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. There was a second beast. It looked like a bear. I want you to just pass down to verse 6 for time. After that I looked, and there was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And then, here, let's get to the interpretation of the dream, because I think this is going to help us understand what are these beasts. So verse 15, I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The four great beasts are four kings that will rise from the earth. But the holy people in the Most High will receive the kingdom and possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the meaning of the fourth beast, because it was the most terrifying. And he goes on. Anyway, we've got the same animals, right? Leopard, bear, lion. And what are these beasts? Well, they're kings. Okay, back to Revelation. In the book of Revelation, John sees one beast, which is an amalgamation of all the beasts he saw in this dream. And if you look at verse 2, it says the dragon gave this beast his power, his throne, and great authority. Well, if the four beasts in Daniel were four different kings and kingdoms, then I would just suggest that what we've got here is, and I'll just give it a name, anti-Christian government, kingdoms that arise, so to speak, and have as its plan or purpose opposing Christ, opposing Christians. You can have early Christians suffering in the Roman Empire, the government, Rome, the emperor. They were all against Christians. There was authority they had, and they were persecuting Christians. Anyway, I'm just going to read the rest of this. We'll start here, verse 3. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he was given authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast and asked, who is like this beast? Who can wage war against it? The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. There's that 3.5-year period again. It opens its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people, to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone's to go into captivity they'll go. If anyone's going to be killed with the sword they'll be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Well, in John's day it was Rome. Are there any other anti-Christian governments that have existed on the face of this planet? Are there any now? I think the book of Revelation is suggesting that behind those governments is the work of Satan, who is seeking to torment God's people. And perhaps, I think this is the point of verse 10, Christians are going to have to go into captivity. After all, John was. Perhaps there are Christians who are going to be killed. This beast has tremendous authority. There's a second beast. This starts in verse 11. It says, then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs, it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast. It deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands and on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it's the number of man. That number is 666. Wow, time is passing so quickly. All right, let's talk about this beast. I'm just going to make a statement here, and then you can follow up by studying and thinking about it, that this second beast represents anti-Christian religion. Maybe the easiest way to see this is in verse 11. John looks, he sees the second beast. It's coming out of the earth. It says it has two horns like a lamb. Boy, it looks like a lamb. Okay, in the book of Revelation, who's the lamb? Jesus, right? It looks like Jesus. But it says it spoke like a dragon. So it has all the appearance of someone wonderful and someone good. But what comes out of his mouth is nothing but evil. It talks about how this beast is given authority to perform miracles, even causing fire to come down from heaven. So, this beast seems to be able to do counterfeit miracles, as though it really has some religious power. Finally, you'll remember this. We talked about the 144,000. Remember, before the final judgment came, they received a seal on their forehead. And it seems this beast is doing something very similar, is sealing, his people, so to speak, with the seal on their forehead and on their right arm. And it says they don't even have the power to buy or sell unless they have the mark of this beast. Boy, 3 minutes left. I guess I better say something about 666, right? If you start doing some readings about 666, you're going to find there's all kinds of ideas that people have had. They've thought that maybe because Hebrew letters and numbers, Hebrew letters were used to indicate Hebrew numbers, that perhaps the number 666, if you turn it into letters, spells something. There are all kinds of theories about, maybe this could have been Nero, Caesar. You'll find that. I remember back in the 90s, there were those who were saying, oh, look, if you, turn Saddam Hussein name into numbers, it'll equal 666. All kinds of strange theories about this. For myself, I say to myself, probably we should just stick with the big picture. It says here that this is the number of man. And what day were human beings created on? The sixth day. 6 is one short of 7. So many people have pointed out 6 is an incomplete number. We've talked about this before, that at least to the Old Testament mindset, because we didn't have comparatives and superlatives, if you wanted to say something to the utmost, good, better, best, and you wanted to make the point best, you would just repeat it 3 times. Someone has written this. I think this is about as close as you can get. 666 represents failure, failure, failure. Oftentimes, I make this distinction between Christianity and all the other religions of the world. All the other religions of the world give you a prescription about what you must do. Here, do this, do that. This is how you get connected to God. This is the human effort to solve the problem. Whereas Christianity doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you that it's done. If you look at the religions of the world, in many ways, you'd say, oh, it just looks like Christianity. It is not just like Christianity. One is a God-centered project, which is based on the gospel of Jesus Christ, that he has done everything that's needed to repair our relationship to God. Religion, instead, is the human-centered project, which says you must do what's necessary to bridge the gap and repair your relationship to God. And I think here, anti-Christian government, anti-Christian religion. The anti-Christian religion, it appears a lot like Christianity, but has nothing to do with it. And The big idea is that Satan, who's lost his place in heaven, who's angry, who's persecuting the church, is making use of two powerful realities in this world to persecute God's people: anti-Christian government, anti-Christian religion. Wish we had another 45 minutes to talk about how that applies, but maybe you could make all the application yourself. Are you familiar with anti-Christian government? Are you familiar with anti-Christian religion? I would suggest all Christians are. And there are ways in which Satan is using them. Anyway, I don't want to miss, and here I'm just going to say a few things and then be done, the big picture message. We won't take time to read all of chapter 14. We've already read it. I even sung a little song, right? My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And basically what this chapter communicates is God is going to do something. And the final judgment's coming. And there will be a victory for Jesus and for his people. And there will be a defeat for Satan and those who follow after him.